There's a particular kind of darkness that settles in around midnight. Not the cozy darkness of settling into bed, but the wide awake darkness when sleep just won't come. Maybe you know the kind. The ceiling becomes a screen of all the worries that you've carried throughout the week or into that day. The house creaks. Is that a normal sound? Your phone glows with the time, 2:47 a.m., and you calculate how few hours actually remain between right now and when the alarm is supposed to go off. Now, maybe some of you know midnight moments that have nothing to do with the clock. The phone call from the doctor's office asking you to come back in. The conversation that ends with, "I think we need to talk." The email that begins with, "We regret to inform you." Maybe that moment when the path that you had planned suddenly disappears and you're standing in the dark wondering what has happened. Midnight moments seem to strip away our illusions of control. They can reveal what we actually believe about God, about ourselves, about whether hope is actually real or just something that we talk about during the daylight. The question in our lives isn't whether midnight comes. It will come for all of our lives. The question is what happens when it does. Do we have anything to sing about in the darkness as it presses in on us? And when the ground shakes underneath our lives, will we recognize it as destruction or perhaps, just perhaps, as God making a way when there wasn't one before? We're in the third week of our series, Fresh Start, and we've been exploring how detours can lead at times to somewhere better than our original plans. 2 weeks ago, Thomas discovered that honest doubt could become the doorway to renewed faith. Last week, Dustin Petz brought us our guest preacher, reminded us that Zacchaeus learned that an unexpected invitation could transform everything, his money, his relationships, his entire life. Today, we meet two men in a prison cell and a third man who is guarding them. None of them expected that this night would happen exactly like it did. All of them would be changed by morning. And their story shows us what becomes possible when midnight becomes a moment of decision for us. Now, 2,000 years later, we know, of course, that songs still rise from prison cells. I recently read an article. It was written in February of 2023. A producer named Ian Brennan drove 3 hours through the Mississippi Delta to record inmates singing inside Parchman Farm. This is one of the country's oldest and perhaps most notorious prisons. It had taken him 3 years to gain the appropriate permissions, and the rules were strict. No video, no photographs, no first names. The men who stood to sing that day included murderers and serial offenders, each carrying a story that put him there. And one after another they sang gospels, spirituals. One man freestyled about the shame of causing his mother sorrow. They started scattered around the chapel, but by the last song everyone was singing together. Even the chaplains joined in. A chaplain was quoted afterward as saying, "They were not looked at as an inmate. They were looked at as musicians." The warden's office was watching the live stream of what was going on that day and said that they had never seen joy like that inside the prison. You can go online and listen to this recording today. Singing in the dark place did not undo what had put those men there. They were always human before and after, but the songs perhaps made the world see them in a new way. Paul and Silas began singing in prison 2,000 years ago before Mississippi. In a Philippian jail cell, they lived out the same truth. But here's what changes everything in this story. They choose to sing. At midnight, stripped and beaten, locked in stocks in the innermost prison, they face a decision point that defines their entire passage, this entire story that we hear today. They could have chosen to despair. They could have chosen to rage against injustice. Instead, they chose to pray and sing hymns. This isn't passive acceptance, it's active resistance through worship. And the other prisoners listen, which means something in Paul and Silas' choice, becoming contagious, becoming visible, becoming real in the lives of other people. Now the jailer faces his own decision when the earthquake shakes the foundations loose. He sees the doors are open and he assumes that the prisoners have fled. His choice then seems to be to kill himself rather than to face the punishment that he knew was coming. But Paul's shout, "Don't harm yourself, we're all here," what interrupts that trajectory. The jailer then makes the commitment that costs him everything and gains him everything. He asks, "What must I do to be rescued?" And genuinely listens to the answer. He believes. His whole household is baptized. He welcomes the very men who were imprisoned into his home that night. He feeds them. And the text tells us that he was overjoyed. Overjoyed. Now, some of what is at stake in this passage is nothing less than the question of where our allegiance lies when circumstances become unbearable. For Paul and Silas, it's whether they'll continue witnessing to Christ even when witnessing has cost them freedom and comfort. For the jailer, it's whether he'll risk everything, his job, his status, perhaps even his safety, to join a persecuted movement following Jesus. Both of these sides make choices, but choose to turn toward God, who shakes foundations, and that choice becomes the foundation of everything that follows for them. Now, in our Methodist tradition, we understand that God is already at work in our lives, drawing us toward redemption even before we recognize it. We call this idea prevenient grace, God's grace that comes before, preparing the soil of our hearts for what God is doing. Now, the jailer didn't wake up that morning with a clear idea that he was going to become a follower of Jesus that night. Not at all. He was simply doing his job, maintaining order in a prison. But God was already at work. The earthquake, Paul's shout, the prisoner's presence, these weren't coincidences, perhaps. God was at work in those moments, meeting the jailer with an invitation that he had the chance to choose to receive. Now, this matters because it means that your midnight moments may not be an interruption to God's plan. Because those moments can often be exactly where God shows up most powerfully. When the ground shakes beneath you, when circumstances force you to choose between fear and faith, between despair and praise, that's not God punishing you. It might be God making space for you to say yes to the abundant life that Christ offers us. The jailer's joy came not from avoiding hard circumstances, but from making a decision to trust God within those hard moments. Your own fresh start might happen in exactly the same way, not by waiting for perfect conditions to exist in your life, but by choosing to turn toward God who is already turning toward you. And that choice might look different for each one of us, but it always starts in the same place, exactly where you are. Now, maybe some of us today might still be deciding about faith. Maybe we've been showing up on Sundays, appreciating the music, enjoying the community, but maybe we haven't personally said yes to following Jesus. Maybe we've been watching from a safe distance, like Zacchaeus in his tree. Maybe like those other prisoners who were listening through the prison wall. And maybe today the ground is shifting for you. And the jailer's question is available to all of us. What must I do to be rescued? And the answer is disarmingly simple. Believe and step through the open door to follow God. Now, maybe some of us here have been here before, but maybe drifted away. Life got complicated. faith felt irrelevant or even painful for us. The distance grew until coming back seemed harder than staying away. Now, I want us to hear what happened in that jail in the passage today. A man woke up in the middle of a crisis that he did not create and found grace waiting for him. God doesn't require a clean re-entry. God requires honesty, and that's a place to start. Now, some of us may be committed followers of Jesus who are still holding back one thing in our lives, maybe one area of our life that we've locked the door and told God to stay out, maybe one fear that we're afraid to name before others or even to ourselves, one habit that we won't release, one grudge that we keep feeding in the dark. Paul and Silas stayed in that prison even after every chain fell off. They didn't run towards comfort. They stayed because their witness mattered more than their escape. What would it look like for us to stay faithful in the hard places in our lives? Not out of obligation, but perhaps because we've discovered that our midnight worship matters to someone listening through the walls. The good news is that God has never written off anyone in the darkness. That jailer woke up in a crisis that he didn't create. One moment he was sleeping in the safety of his routine, and the next moment everything was breaking apart. Doors flying open, chains falling off, his whole world shaking. And in his despair, he reached for his sword. But Paul's shout reached him first. Don't harm yourself. We're all here. And that's the good news about God. We never meet God for the first time in our moment of breakthrough. God was already at work in the earthquake. God had already been at work in the jailer's life, whether he'd been paying attention or not, long before that he knew that he needed God. God had drawn faithful people near him even before he knew that he was searching. God had not abandoned Paul and Silas in the dark, even when the system had abandoned them. The jailer wasn't beyond God's reach. His despair wasn't too great for God's grace to reach. And yours isn't either. When the ground shakes beneath you, and it will, remember the jailer's story. Midnight is not the final word. Whatever chains might bind you right now, whatever darkness you're walking through, God has not abandoned you. Your midnight worship matters. Your faithfulness matters. The song that you sing even in dark places reaches further than you might know. And when morning comes, and it will come, the joy you discover will be worth every song that you sang in the darkness. So how do we live as people who believe that morning is coming? Well, as followers of Jesus, we live out our faith through 5 promises: our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, and our witness. This week, I want to invite you to experiment with witness, sharing your faith with others just as Paul and Silas did from that prison cell. Where is your midnight moment right now? Maybe it's in your workplace, among your neighbors, or in your family. Your faithfulness in the difficult places in your life speaks louder than any perfect testimony. Remember that chapel at Parchman Farm? The song that pulled scattered men together until even chaplains and wardens were caught up in the joy. Someone in your life is doing that kind of listening. Someone is watching, waiting to see if your faith holds in the darkness. So this week, be the prisoner who sings. Live your faith in a visible way. Invite one person to experience this community. Maybe share one way that God has shaken the foundations of your life and opened a door for you that you thought was locked. In a few months this summer, we're going to be launching grace groups, small communities of 6 to 8 people who gather weekly for an hour to watch over one another in love. And whether you're facing midnight or experiencing morning, These communities will exist so you don't have to figure out your faith alone. You'll hear more as we get closer in the weeks ahead. And I want to invite you also to consider giving to the United Methodist Student Day offering if you're able. There's students across the country right now who are sitting in their own midnight moments. Perhaps the weight of tuition costs against dreams that feel further away than ever. Your gift might become the earthquake that opens the door for them. When the jailer saw that those open doors, he thought that his world had ended. But Paul's shout reached him, "We're all here." And that same shout still echoes. God has placed witnesses around you. People whose faith in dark places can reach you when you're about to give up. The chains may fall, the ground may shake, and when morning comes, you might discover that someone stayed faithful in the dark, and that faithfulness can lead us home. Will you pray with me? Oh God, shake loose our fears. Open the doors that we've locked, and teach us to sing in the darkness so others hear your hope. Amen.